Welcome to this Hudson event on China's charm diplomacy and China's efforts to build a health Silk Road during the corona crisis. We have at hudson.org a website where you can find all our podcasts, publications, and events on the corona crisis. Please visit it. Today, I will moderate the event. I'm Lisa Lotte Odgaard. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, specializing in US-China-Europe relations and Arctic security. I will base my moderation on a recently published Hudson report on China's strategic influence overseas, which is called Double-Edged Aid, and you can also find that on Hudson's website. Today, I have with me three distinguished speakers from Hudson. First, we have Senior Fellow Peter Rao, who's a specialist on transatlantic relations and Europe. Second, I have with me Aparna Panda, who's a director for the initiative on the future of India and South Asia. And lastly, but not least, I have Patrick Cronin, who holds a chair at Hudson in Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific Security, Asia-Pacific Security Chair, sorry. And he specializes in Indo-Pacific security, how the US is meeting the challenges there. And these three people will comment on how China's charm diplomacy is received in Europe, in South Asia, and in East Asia. They have all produced numerous publications, and some of those can be found on the Hudson website. Until 11:45 a.m., I will moderate a debate with our three speakers. And then from 11:45 until noon, I will take questions from the audience and direct them to the speakers. You can ask your questions by emailing events at hudson.org, or you can tweet them to Hudson Institute. First, one of the conclusions in the report, Double-Edged Aid, is that China uses charm diplomacy in the sense that it plugs into unmet needs where no one else offers assistance. And this has also been China's approach during the corona crisis. It has offered to send medical doctors. It has offered equipment when Europe was slow to respond. Peter, how is this charm diplomacy, how has it been received in Europe? Can you tell us if it has helped China being seen as a benevolent power who looks after Europe when the EU fails to respond, at least initially, or has it backfired on China?
Well, maybe I can just start with a general principle, and that is that I think China is generally comfortable with the contours of the international system. The United States, at least until the time of Donald Trump, seems to have facilitated China's rise. It's brought it into various regimes, allowed it to benefit from, say, globalization. It's also been able to profit through the international system, but not really had to carry its burdens. Worse yet, it's really taken advantage of aspects of the West. It's thieved intellectual property. It has built out militarized islands, built a 9-dash line in the South China Sea, as we're aware of, all of which really haven't faced major consequences. And I say all of that with a view towards Europe because in general, I think China's approach towards Europe is one to avoid confrontation because it does think in many respects it's winning. Now, there are exceptions to that. When the Europeans, for example, hit out about, say, Xinjiang or Tibet, 5G infrastructure build-outs through Huawei, or say theft of intellectual property, there's a very strong response. One, of course, thinks of the ambassador in Stockholm that Beijing has posted there. Also, the ambassador in residence in Berlin has threatened the entire German car industry when the German government was deliberating whether or not to adopt or exclude Huawei from the 5G infrastructure auction. So my view is that China has, as a general principle, looked not to confront through brash actions Europe, but to pick off countries that have weak political or economic systems, and now layered on top of that, medical or public health needs. And so we've seen them work aggressively through Greece, where of course China has a major stake in the port of Piraeus. It's also worked in Italy very loudly and publicly with great media fanfare, delivering medical goods to the Italians. Luigi Di Maio, the foreign minister, was one of the major drivers behind Italy as one of the really large original signatories to the Treaty of Rome, one of the really originators of Europe, both civilizationally and in the modern construct, having joined the Belt and Road Initiative. So China has identified weaknesses or weak countries, which it sought to infiltrate as a general project of weakening the West and the American-led transatlantic alliance. And I'd say there's a second component to it, and that is countries which are relatively robust, like the Netherlands, have also had investments or Chinese goods flow there because these are facing strategic decisions in the coming months. The Netherlands has a big 5G auction coming up in the early part of the summer. So the Chinese there, with a view towards trying to score some propaganda points, have also sought to push some goods there. None of it is out of pure humanitarian motive. I think it is all part of a broader strategic project. How has it fared? Well, I think in part it was successful. It certainly convinced some, what I think are rather naive Western observers, that there's a dawn of a Chinese century in the offing, and this is really the moment when that transition is taking place. But it's also served to puncture the aura of Chinese competency, because we've seen a lot of these medical goods that have flowed to these European states not work. They've been deficient. And although Europe was very lumbering and slow and solidarity was somewhat lacking, we now see the Germans, for example, and other European states making big investments in Europe. And some of these countries, I would also add, while they might seem open to the Chinese, they're also playing a deaf game. Like the Serbs know that their future is more likely to lie with Europe than it is with China, that Europe has more to offer than China, but it might be a leverage point to try to convince the Europeans to do more, to provide more aid. There are internal European dynamics over things like fiscal solidarity, Euro bonds, and so forth that are at play here as well. So by and large, I think it's part of China flowing through traditional channels it's established rather than swimming against the stream. And secondly, an attempt to pick off states. But I would say that at best, it's a mixed bag for the Chinese. Thanks,
Peter. So what about South Asia, Parna? There we have India. They have issued an even more tough lockdown than China did, it seems. And they're not necessarily on that good terms with China always. Does it mean that they're competing, is India able to compete with China and also exercise charm diplomacy in its near abroad? Or is it subject to Chinese influence at this time? And what about Pakistan, who seems almost given up on locking down?
Thanks, Lieslott. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. Actually, China has continued its charm offensive in South Asia, both through offering medical teams, sending faulty test kits and protective equipment, as well as actually offering to build makeshift hospitals. But the results have been a mixed bag. Pakistan and Sri Lanka, the countries heavily dependent on Chinese largesse, have been the most open to and reciprocated Beijing's charms. For Pakistan, the strategic relationship with China takes priority over everything else, including the health of its own people. So Pakistan refused to evacuate its citizens from China when COVID first broke out, like Iran, and did not suspend flights to and from China till almost early March. India has not openly criticized China, but it has sought to counter any Chinese charm offensive by seeking a coordinated regional SAARC response. So there's a SAARC COVID fund to which India contributed $10 million and many other countries contributed money as well. India has sent medical teams to Nepal, Maldives, Bhutan. It has sent test kits, protective equipment, and also built quarantine shelters in Nepal and Maldives. Plus India has 2 naval ships which are ready to be deployed to any country that needs assistance in the region. In the case of Sri Lanka, however, Sri Lanka has gone ahead and signed a 10-year loan of $500 million with the China Development Bank to help the country mitigate the financial impact of the crisis.
Thank you. And then we have Patrick, East Asia. What does it look like there? China's neighbors, they have been praised, some of them, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and others, Singapore, for doing well. But how have their interaction been with China during this crisis? And how have they been subject to charm diplomacy?
Well, Lise, I think you're right to mention South Korea, because South Korea under President Moon was the first government really to reach out to China and to try to extend a hand when China was under siege with the growing virus out of Wuhan, and then throughout China in January into early February. They had a phone call, in fact, in February, where they were closely coordinating travel and aid. President Moon had a few missteps, like all other presidents, though, and leaders in dealing with this crisis. He talked about wanting to share the pain with China. Well, that unfortunately came to pass, and South Korea became the other actor in Asia after China with the most cases of the Wuhan, with the COVID-19 virus. And as a result, it was able to then flip into gear and show off South Korea's healthcare system, which I'll talk about later. I think for China, though, they went from being on the back foot to going on the offensive in terms of PR in the region about 2 weeks ago. And there you see the assistance through medical supplies, mass diplomacy, testing kits to the Philippines. Although that didn't all go smoothly, as Peter had suggested, in this case, the Department of Health in Manila declared that a lot of these test kits were defective. That was a loss of face for China. China kind of took umbrage and immediately put out a defense of the test kit, saying, hey, these are up to World Health Organization standards. And if you go to some place like the Chinese embassy website in Manila and in the Philippines, you'll see an incredible infomercial every hour about what they're doing, providing physical aid, defending their role. The Philippines being one of the least prepared to deal with the pandemic compared to some of the wealthier countries in East Asia, like Korea and Japan or Singapore or Taiwan. As a result, China's now marketing its model. So they're doing this, I think, globally, but in the region as well, that you've got this PRC tutorial essentially now on prevention, control, and treatment. I think we heard President Trump essentially allude in his long conversation this week with Xi Jinping that he was learning a lot about China's program for treatment and prevention. And I think that's what China's selling. They're selling this, not just Health Silk Road as a model, which is redolent, obviously, of their fairly successful brand with the Belt and Road Initiative in the region, but they're also now trying to be seen as the experienced model to emulate. Now, not everybody is feeling the charm in Asia, and in particular, the one actor who's not is Taiwan. I mean, so much so that not only is Taiwan still cut out of everything in terms of international health cooperation, as far as Beijing wants, you actually had a Chinese artist depicting Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen surrendering to the PRC on a Chinese aircraft carrier. That was just 2 weeks ago. That's incredible that you'd have that kind of propaganda coming out against Taiwan when you're promoting this very positive, you're trying to promote a very positive image about what China's able to constructively do to fight this crisis together.
Thank you, Patrick. The last point about Taiwan, I think, also brings us to the second conclusion from the report, which is about China's seemingly benevolent behavior, sometimes turning into a not so nice behavior, where it uses its enhanced influence to put pressure on countries to, for example, implement or choose Huawei for their 5G network and other things. Have you seen that kind of behavior in your respective regions, this kind of behind the scenes pressure that China sometimes exercises? Has that become a factor in your respective regions? Peter, do you want to answer with regard to Europe?
I think that the pressure was there before. It was very intense, as I suggested earlier. Whenever the deliberations have been ongoing in Europe within governments to decide how to structure their auctions, whether or not to allow Huawei, which is really the next big play, to build out telecommunications across the continent. Whenever we've seen that in the last a few months, the Chinese have been much more aggressive. That strategy of hiding and biding, of avoiding confrontation, has given way towards really aggressive threatening of the German automobile industry. But that's just one example of several. So that's been there. I don't think the coronavirus crisis fundamentally changes that, for the following reason. For one, these are medical goods that are very important. They're life-saving and critical right now, but as a percentage of European countries' GDP, they're relatively small, minute, in fact, in most places. And so these aren't debt traps that can be turned into political leverage the way they might be in other parts of the world. And then secondly, there are huge economic powerhouses who have a vital stake in keeping Europe united in a way that might not apply to some of the peripheral regions of this world if we're just thinking about economic zones. So we've already seen the Germans announce, if they don't go with the European Stability Mechanism versus kind of Euro bonds, which are the dividing lines between North and South respectively, an aid package that might run into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The Chinese can't compete with that. They won't compete with that. They will look again for opportunities to pick off political and economic weak actors. But that is a lot of money. That is a real effort that I think Europe will put into it. And so the pressure will continue the way it did before in terms of the export-import markets that we have between Asia and Europe. And there might be additional dynamics coming out of this about repatriating very narrow supply chains. Europe is not in the same place the US is when it comes to this debate about decoupling writ large, but it certainly will consider bringing home some critical antibiotic supply chains, for example, if it's deemed that this has not worked well and that Europe was caught unprepared, as it was, just like the United States. So I don't think it's quite the same situation because Europe is wealthier. There are more options, and there are countries who are willing to step in and push back against that pressure. But the pressure was there before, and it will continue afterward.
Thanks, Peter. Aparna, in South Asia, India, Pakistan, or any of the other smaller states on the Indian subcontinent, is there this kind of pressure from China?
So there is, but I think it's like more like a competition between two. It's the Chinese pressure, which is subtle right now, not too overt, except when you see Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So with Pakistan and Sri Lanka, it is seen because Pakistan refuses to criticize China. Actually, Pakistani leaders like a former ambassador to the United Nations and the Prime Minister's scientific advisor are actually peddling conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus. And they're blaming the United States and United Kingdom and absolving China of any responsibility. Plus, as I mentioned, Pakistan refused to evacuate citizens. It is praising China and Chinese assistance, accepting Chinese kits, equipment. And Sri Lanka actually signed a 10-year loan, which increases the amount of debt Sri Lanka has from China. So those two exceptions, the other countries in the region, Nepal, Maldives, Bangladesh, which were close to China, actually have started moving a little away. One, because of the fact that Nepal and Maldives actually said they got faulty test kits. And India was a little faster and quicker in sending equipment and assistance, and actually pushing not Indian assistance, but saying, let's go regional. Let's make a South Asian or a SAARC COVID fund. Let all the countries contribute to it. So there's been a sort of India versus China. Second part I'd like to mention is that China has been trying a charm offensive with all the countries, including India. April 1st was the anniversary of in 1950, April 1st, 1950, India and China had sort of signed the first acceptance of diplomatic relations. So there's been a massive charm offensive by the Chinese embassy in India, but it doesn't really seem to have made much of a difference. More Indians are suspicious of where and what China's role is. So I'd say it's a mixed bag across South Asia.
Hey, thank you. Patrick,
Yes,
any pressure from China? Any behind the scenes nasty affairs? Apart from Taiwan?
behind the scenes may be difficult to tell, but quite overtly, even before the coronavirus pandemic, we saw this mixture of charm, coercion, and disinformation, which Ryan Newhart and I have chronicled in terms of Southeast Asia in our report on so-called total competition. I think that hasn't really stopped, although there's been more rhetoric than action because China's been so internally focused, obviously, on its own health crisis for these past couple of months. But as the situation evolves and gets worse in terms of the pandemic in Asia Pacific, I expect China to get more active as well. Let's recall that, outside of China, including South Korea and all of East Asia and the Pacific down to Australia and New Zealand, there are only about 700 deaths so far. Compare that to one single day in America right now. And you can see that this vast region hasn't yet suffered really the consequences. And that's both been because of some success stories I'll talk about, but also because it just hasn't reached there yet. It's just starting to seemingly get a grip in places like Indonesia. But Malaysia, Philippines have also been sort of on the front lines. And now they're very worried down in Australia, among other places. I think it's important to talk about the fact that China's been very actively still coercing Indonesia and the Philippines, even while they're providing assistance and medical teams. It's somewhat remarkable. It's like the left hand and the right hand are not really joined up on this in terms of the Chinese machinery. But if you think about the biggest success, declared success on dealing with the coronavirus in the world, it's North Korea. Because according to Pyongyang, and of course everybody believes Pyongyang, North Korea has 0 cases of this pandemic still. And yet they've been actively trying to get as much aid as possible from China and United Nations assistance, even though they have no cases. In reality, we think they do have cases. They're very worried about this. And it's not been a matter of pressure. It's been a matter of Chinese taking advantage of the opportunity to show that they're befriending their neighbors, that they've coordinated with South Korea, they're helping North Korea, and they're trying to help the Philippines and others in the region. They're trying to calm economic upheaval in the financial markets, the supply chains that are backing up, the concern about a financial crisis that could be brewing. They're trying to keep their Belt and Road Initiative on the back burner, saying, look, it's just a temporary slowdown. It's going to be coming. We're going to be looking for more connectivity. So it's been less coercion overtly and more sort of the charm offensive taking the front row here.
Thank you, Patrick. A third conclusion in the report is that China often is very good at using multilateral international organizations to legitimize their behavior and to help them promote their interests. In this case, the world has looked to the World Health Organization as a focal point for telling them, when is this a pandemic and what should we do? And the World Health Organization has had a lot of praise for China. How do you see their role and how is it seen in your respective regions? Is the WHO taken seriously? Is it seen as too China dependent? Can it be still take the lead when we experience these global pandemics? How does the WHO appear from your regional perspective, Peter?
Well, I do think the interview that the director of the WHO had with, may have been a Taiwanese journalist, but basically in the interview, the director pretended not to hear the question on how Taiwan was performing. And I think that shocked even the Europeans. So anecdotally, there are breakthroughs, I think, in subtle ways like that. By and large, though, anything that's part of the UN system, the Europeans tend to like. And so I think that the World Health Organization, because it aims for global cooperation and other such very European-esque ideas, it's seen as something that's good, that can bring the world together to fight this. This isn't a failure of China, it's a failure of world cooperation, is a narrative one hears time and again. So that's, I think, generally the European view. I'll just add my own red meat American view, which is this is another example where the US pays all the bills but gets virtually zero play out of it. The last I saw, and I may be wrong about this, but I think the US contribution in 19 was something like 400 or 420 billion, or 400 or 410 million dollars. And the second biggest donor to the WHO is less than half of that. The Chinese pay a fraction of it. And yet here we have, just because one is fearful of alienating the Chinese and therefore blowing up this concept of international cooperation, kowtowing to the Chinese. So it's disappointing. I think it's damaged the World Health Organization in the United States. But in Europe, I think it's seen as an essential vehicle and it will continue to play an important role. For them, this is a hiccup, but not something that will structurally change the organization.
Okay. Aparna, is there a different view in South Asia?
Actually, the view in South Asia is quite similar to Europe.
Okay.
Most South Asian countries, as developing countries, and India as the founding members of UN, they believe that international organizations have a role to play. Some countries may try and sway that, but by and large, all South Asian countries do believe that it's more important to be part of the international organizations, to accept and obtain the assistance and be part of the global community. And open criticism of WHO is not as much of a priority when you're focusing on obtaining supplies and test kits and assistance and setting up makeshift shelters. So if WHO gives the assistance, that is more important. The criticism can come later.
Okay, thanks. And Patrick, you have some US allies in your region, but also some China supporters. How is the WHO effort seen in East Asia?
Well, it's a big region with diverse views, but you're
True.
right. I think China is seen as a beneficiary, though, of how the WHO has kind of treated China with kid gloves throughout this crisis. Certainly in America and in American allied countries in Asia, there's a lot of skepticism about the WHO not calling this a pandemic early on. I mean, the world was screaming pandemic, and the WHO was saying, "Oh no, don't worry, it's not that big a deal," almost. And WHO has not been skeptical about Chinese data, even the origins of this virus. And I think there in the region, as in America and as in Europe, probably there's a lot of skepticism about that data. We're preoccupied with fighting the virus together, so we're going to put that to the side. But still, there's a lot of skepticism. And then, of course, as Peter mentioned, the kind of holding Taiwan at bay is kind of a shameful record, unfortunately, for the WHO. Now, speaking about international organizations from an American perspective, we sort of sow what we reap. If we don't engage with these international agencies, if we neglect them, ignore them until we finally need them, what do we expect? Chinese have been nurturing this behavior and relationship, so they're very much harvesting what they've been trying to plant here on this. But from a Chinese human perspective, national perspective aside, the heroes, I think, in China are not the WHO, not even Beijing. It's really the local responders. So it's Dr. Li, the whistleblower whose warnings were suppressed and then he succumbed to the disease. It's Wang Fang, who's the local writer in Wuhan, who chronicled the day-to-day life and what it was really like. That's sort of the much more human dimension, I think, of how China sees this. So the WHO is a big international question, sure, but mostly this is a local community problem around the world.
Which has also revealed some voices that might be seen as critical of China's handling of the corona crisis. Now that we're at the issue of organizations, I would like to return to Peter. There are some pretty established organizations or institutions in Europe. There's NATO, and of course, there's the semi-sovereign European Union. What will be the outcome of this crisis for them? How has this influenced NATO and the European Union and their role in security? And is it a significant crisis for the future, for their future role in Europe, in your view, and in transatlantic relations, of course?
Well, NATO just held its first ever virtual ministerial, I think yesterday, or maybe it was the day before. No, it was yesterday. And it celebrated North Macedonia participating for the first time. It's the latest and newest NATO member state, which is something to be happy about and which was cheered. Also, traditional security issues which don't wait on the coronavirus were on the agenda: Iraq, Afghanistan, readiness, capacity building, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, the entire meeting was overshadowed by the coronavirus. NATO is a military organization focused on hard power questions, and it should remain as such. Having said that, by its very nature, it has certain capabilities that lend themselves towards fighting a pandemic. For example, its logistics capability. And there is a logistics component, a European-American logistic response center that has been activated. It facilitated, for example, Turkey sending shipments to Italy of medical goods. That was basically entirely a NATO coordinated operation. So NATO can play an important coordinating role in the pandemic itself. It also has a hugely important role in deterrence, which is, of course, its classic mission. But I think at a time when energy prices have plummeted, Russia is quarantining its population, that could have effects on the Russians. And we know that when times are down and out in Russia, sometimes it goes seeking abroad for foreign enemies to slay, to build up and boost public popularity at home. And the West is preoccupied right now. So the Enhanced Deterrence Initiative, the European Deterrence Initiative, which is really the cornerstone of Baltic and Eastern European security right now, I think needs to be redoubled, needs to be focused on. That plays an important role. And NATO's southern flank can't be neglected, where there's actually a hot war going on in Idlib, where the Russians have also been meddling. There's another component, I think, for NATO that's worrying, and that is force protection. I mean, we saw the events in the USS Roosevelt over the last couple of days, where soldiers, by their very nature, the duties they're assigned, have to operate in tight quarters with one another. And so how do you ensure that your frontline troops are ready, are healthy, are fit, are able to maneuver, to operate? And that applies, I think, to the European Deterrence Initiative in particular. More broadly, I think we're very focused oftentimes, I think, on the tactics of the moment, but this will change the power of the West, will also limit the power of other countries, but economies are cratering. And so the age-old discussion that was raised at the 2014 Wales Summit about Europe and the United States and Canada spending 2% of GDP on defense, that's going to be impacted by this. Even in boom times, Europe doesn't, or some European states aren't interested in spending 2% on defense. What's going to happen when times are souring, when times are bad? And when economies are cratering. So I think, if a military rests on economic foundations, or as Napoleon put it, armies march on their stomachs, I think that's generally the phrase, then, we need strong economies to be able to fund a strong military. So that's an issue. And then I'll just say very quickly, European Union is an immature, kind of half-built organization. It's not quite a full nation state, but it's also not quite just a general intergovernmental organization. And so that weakness of being halfway across the tightrope when strong winds gust up really can be dangerous. And we're seeing that in that divisions between North and South are being accentuated. At other times we've seen East versus West, but this is a huge, serious test for European Union. You could see the Southern Europeans, they're polling coming out of Italy, where numbers in support of European Union have plummeted. The statement that European Union does not do us any good has risen quite a bit. This is before Europe's really sprung into action, but I think that's a big issue, and that's the problem, I think, of assigning an organization with a brittle identity in major crises functions, because you end up having basically people who have more allegiance and loyalty to their individual countries, but they look to Brussels for answers, and that's a big problem. So I think generally NATO and Europe, the European Union face big tests, and so sort of the Brits, who we left out, but that's for another story, maybe another Zoom, Hudson weather then.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Aparna, your region has a lot of developing countries, and there has been a lot of talk about, that this is going to smash them over completely, because now the developed world is focused on their own economic situation and, fending for themselves. So there isn't going to be much assistance to these countries that need it. And also they have trouble implementing a lockdown. So in Pakistan, for example, Khan has said, well, we can't afford a lockdown. And some of the regions have tried to implement a more forceful lockdown, but I think it's very difficult for them. Can you say anything about how do you see, what is this going to do to these countries and their role in the world?
So three things. One, there has been a vast difference, sort of mixed bag on the lockdown. India, Bangladesh, actually Nepal and Maldives have done a much better. Maldives started a lockdown actually in early March, one of the first countries in the region to lock down, because they get tourists from China. And so they basically stopped flights. So 3 or 4 countries have a lockdown. India is going through its 3-week lockdown, which is till April 14th. Most countries in the world, as we well know, find it very difficult to keep people at home. So imagine keeping people at home in a 1.3 billion country like India, or about 1.8 billion people as South Asia does. Pakistan has chosen deliberately not to do a lockdown, though it can implement it. And the problems it is facing, actually Pakistan and Bangladesh are facing, is more when it comes to religious gatherings. Because a number of the cases which have arisen in India and Pakistan have been due to these religious gatherings. The second point is that while the states are locking down, there are problems which will come because even though India's lockdown has been quite harsh, India has migrants who are moving. India's tried to control that, been very difficult. There are also religious gatherings which happened. So, but if you look at the numbers of cases, the South Asian region and countries have very few cases as of now. India's cases are around 2,000, Pakistan's around 2,500, 600. Then it's Afghanistan, less than 300, primarily from Iran. About 150 in Bangladesh and much less in Maldives and Nepal. So the numbers are low. And the countries are hoping that keeping people indoors in the lockdown for about 3 weeks or 4 weeks will reduce that number. Because final point, it will have a massive economic impact. However, as of now, the World Bank and IMF do not see India and China facing as much of a recession as many other countries. Part of the reason for India is that India's economy rests primarily on Indian consumers. And so I think the Indian government is going to try and provide some form of financial assistance so people can actually purchase, consume, as well as give support to small industries, to larger industries, and provide some support to the broader general poor population. But yes, it's going to have an economic impact. It's also going to have a larger social impact, keeping people indoors for so long. Once you release them and let them go out, when do you do that? 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, or 2 months from now? And so developing countries will have a problem, but if they can keep the numbers down, I think they have a better chance of surviving this pandemic than many other parts of the world.
Thank you, Aparna. Patrick, in your region, we have Japan, and that seems to have been a bit of an outlier in this situation. Could you comment a bit more on Japan's role during all this crisis, how they've handled it?
Well, Liz, as you know, of course, Japan was looking forward to hosting the Olympics this summer, and that has to be now put off for about 1 year. And as a result, Japan seemed to be minimizing the risk of the coronavirus, and now the cases are rising. And so there are worries that Prime Minister Abe may have to announce an emergency here in the coming days. Japan is still uncertain as to how well this is going to be handled, whether they're going to have a spike and whether they'll be able to then flatten the curve. So it's a bit too soon to say, but there's certainly a lot of trepidation right now in Japan. If you look at other actors in the region, you'd have to say that Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore have been the examples to follow so far. And if you look at what are the attributes that tie those three together, it's a quality national investment in public health already that was pre-existing well before the crisis. It was preparedness for a pandemic, literally medically, industrially, legally, in terms of data collection, preparing for a possible infectious disease epidemic in all three of those places, transparency, which is different from China, and a whole of society sense of vigilance down to citizen responsibility. And I think those are the attributes that are really bringing about that success, and we should be looking to emulate them as they fit into our democracy and our republic.
Thank you, Patrick. Before we turn to the audience, and please, if you have more questions, either send an email to events@hudson.org or Twitter Hudson Institute. I have a final question for you all. Do you think the corona crisis has permanently strengthened China's position in your respective regions? Will they look more to China for global leadership in future as a result of China's behavior? Or has China had some superficial short-term gains, but also some setbacks that means that it's just business as usual? Has it strengthened the sort of lines of conflicts in your region, China's behavior, or is it the same? Starting with you, Peter.
I really don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. I think a lot depends on what happens over the coming months. I mean, China hasn't faced a recession since Deng Xiaoping put in place this model in 1980. And so who's to say how the Chinese are going to come out of this? There's an argument to be made that a lot of the shipments toward Europe are, yes, about getting a foothold in Europe, but they're also about projecting strength back home. Look what a great country China is. We had a century of humiliation, and now the Europeans, the West, is begging China for support, and they're greeting us on airport tarmacs with flags waving. And so when you failed at home and you've had an outbreak through an entire province, and we know what happened in Wuhan, and on top that steeped on top of protests that had taken place in Hong Kong. My colleague John Lee has chronicled in another report some of the structural imbalances in the Chinese economy. You know, China itself might be on weak footing. I'll let Patrick speak to that. He has more expertise, but I do think some of it depends on how China unfolds. Some of it depends on how much I think the liberal democracies of the West believe in themselves and how they behave going forward. It depends on the American leadership role. It depends on how this crisis continues to unfold. But you know, there are a couple of narratives out there, and they're still not entirely played out. To what extent has Chinese mendacity robbed the West of months of preparation for what was truly a pandemic? To what extent was the WHO refusal to label this a pandemic early on stealing valuable time for us to prepare for this? We may not have taken preparatory steps like this was another SARS episode, but really understood that this is of a much different dimension and scope. So, you know, that narrative could play out. The other one could be that the Chinese have sent some things to Europe and the Europeans have been happy with them until they're proven to be defective. Who knows? But we're really in the heart of the crisis. And if there's one thing I've learned about crisis management is that there are lots of unknowns, and we'll have to wait to see how it plays out.
Thanks, Peter. Aparna, South Asia.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Actually, South Asia, as I mentioned, it's going to it'll vary depending on the country. So for countries which were already deep in China's grasp, like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Beijing's grip will be strengthened. The $10 million 10-year loan to Sri Lanka, the assistance to Pakistan, and the rhetoric coming out of Sri Lanka and Pakistan demonstrates sort of what China would like to hear, from conspiracy theories to praise. For countries like Maldives, Nepal, and Bangladesh, which accepted Chinese assistance, actually the Indian response, Indian assistance, and assistance which was not faulty, unlike the Chinese test kits, but actual money, assistance, technical teams, hospitals India set up, will actually increase India's leverage more and take these countries away. They're a little more wary of Chinese assistance now. In crises like pandemics. Finally, for India, while India is sort of refraining from open criticism of China, the Indian media has been criticizing China for the last few weeks. So there's been a growing sort of where the state has allowed the media to criticize, and there's a growing wariness of sort of Beijing's intentions, notwithstanding the rhetoric coming out of China, which is praising the India-China relationship.
Thank you, Aparna. And Patrick, East Asia, does it change anything? China's role?
It probably will change things. I've written a piece on the geostrategic impact of the coronavirus that you can find on the Hudson website. But I think echoing some of Peter's comments in particular about China being in a less advantageous place today than it was, say, during the global financial crisis, when it came out stronger and punching essentially globally and in the region. It's not clear yet how deep the economic recession will hit, whether the financial crisis that China's coming up to the edge of a crisis potentially here with their sort of relief on finance, easy lending could be toxic for China. It certainly is going to put a crimp on some of their investments. And yet more connectivity, more people wanting those secure supply chains. So it cuts both ways, and it's just too early to say exactly which way it's going to cut. that's why it behooves the United States and like-minded countries, especially democracies, to think about how to positively strengthen their own role and their own economies while keeping secure and working together and not retrenching too much inward, even if we now have to all be mindful of being too dependent on China for pharmaceuticals, for high technology, for other critical areas that could make us vulnerable in future crises.
Just because I think saying I don't know is rather boring, I will make one prediction for you, and that is, I suspect that the American-Chinese, the Sino-U.S. rivalry is going to intensify and accelerate, and if that takes place, if that occurs, then Europe will face, I think, more American pressure, more urgent attempts to bring the Europeans on board into kind of an American approach towards China, and so it'll intensify the American-European discussion on China, which is good for business for you, Lisa, because that's what you work on, right?
True. Thanks for that, Peter. I will turn to the audience's questions, and you can still direct questions to us either by emailing events@hudson.org or twittering Hudson Institute. There's a question for you, Aparna. Is India similarly dependent on China for basic medical supplies and medicine? You've touched upon it, but
so India India is in many ways the developing world's pharmaceuticals paradise, and so India has a lot. So, for example, chloroquine, which is being used in many countries to combat COVID, India actually exported a lot of chloroquine to the United States. Now they've stopped because India needs to use it for its own population. But India has a lot of pharmaceutical companies. They are dependent on some specific chemicals from China, and that is going to create problems if the longer this pandemic lasts. But by and large, India does have a strong domestic pharmaceuticals industry.
Thank you. And there's also a question about US-India relations. Will they cooperate on holding China to account for the cover-up of the virus?
So I would say that, I think the UN Security Council presidency has changed, right? It's no longer China. I believe the Dominican Republic has taken over. And so there's going to be a discussion on COVID pandemic at UN Security Council. So I believe there will be some collaboration between India and the US. India would not want very open criticism, but India would welcome China providing some more information about when the pandemic started, how long, and what actually started it. We really don't know the details. We don't know when it started. We don't know from where it came, and we don't know how long China has been hiding the information and how many people were actually impacted in China.
Yeah. Patrick, there's a question on Taiwan. So maybe it's really more for Peter. Will the European member states' relationship with Taiwan change significantly, Peter, as a result of how China has handled this crisis?
Well, Taiwan has brilliantly exported, I think it's masks, some essential medical equipment to the Europeans and made that announcement in the last couple of days. And that's gotten a lot of, I think, positive press in Europe and in the US. Presumably these actually work. And so that will generate a lot of goodwill. But does this change the basic political dynamic? I don't think so. I don't think that recognition of Taiwan, for example, is anywhere on the horizon. I don't think a separate inclusion of Taiwan in different organizations is going to be something that European states will support. But again, I think that Taiwan's gained a lot of goodwill from Europe. I think people, by and large, see that the Chinese haven't always been above board on these sorts of things. But as a general point, I think if one thinks of American views on this crisis, Europe has similar views, similar vectors, but they're less intense, right? So the Americans are, I think, very much so focused on Chinese complicity in covering this up. The Europeans are aware of that, but it's not quite as visceral, I think, as it is for the United States. And so the same might apply to Taiwan. So yes, it's very important. I think people, it'll buy a lot of goodwill. Will it cause drastic political changes? Maybe not. That's not a very nuanced answer. Maybe Patrick can offer a better one.
Yeah, and Patrick, for you, there's also a couple of questions on North Korea, which you've already talked about, but do you see any attempt at coordination between North Korea and China? What are the geopolitical causes behind North Korea's behavior during the crisis? If you could comment a bit more on that.
I will. I would just like to add a word to Peter's comments on Taiwan.
Yes.
President Tsai Ing-wen immediately mobilized 30 private sector companies in Taiwan when this crisis broke out to manufacture masks specifically to both address the shortfall in Taiwan, but also then now to be able to make these gifts abroad. In this past week, President Tsai actually gave the United States 2 million of these masks, which was extraordinary, given the fact that Taiwan is still dealing with a crisis. But China then quickly announced that it was going to give 3 million masks. So it's just a reminder, when it comes to Taiwan, there's more chicanery than charm in China's mass diplomacy, and we have to be mindful of that. On North Korea is partly dissembling to out of internal fear. The Kim regime is extraordinarily fearful of the germ and the virus swamping not only the healthcare system that is virtually non-existent outside of Pyongyang, but also taking even his life potentially, one has to assume. And I think that's why we've seen a continuation of both missile and multiple launch rocket system launches in the previous 4 or 5 weeks out of North Korea. I think it's why we've seen North Korea take a hard line when it comes to America and President Trump's offer of assistance to North Korea. You might say that was more of a rhetorical offer to kind of a goodwill gesture, and it was. But North Korea kind of pushed back on it, and partly because they know that the economic lifeline for the Kim regime right now is running to China. So I don't know if that's coordination, but it's definitely, we saw in the embassy in North Korea in Beijing these last couple of weeks, put up very prominently outside the photos of Kim and Xi's last summit meeting, which seemed to be a pretty clear signal for centralized government of North Korea that China is #1 right now in North Korea's book because they need it economically. And they know that that's the vector as well for the virus to some extent. So they're very worried about that. And they just don't trust anybody. They don't even trust China, but they need them economically at the moment.
Thank you. Peter, there's a question on Huawei, and you mentioned the UK, and Boris Johnson has already made comments on Huawei during this corona crisis. Will it influence Europe's willingness to use Huawei for their 5G?
I don't think so. I think for the most part, the decisions that were going to be taken are going to be taken one way or another. I don't think that this will, there's no tying of Huawei to specific aid. I mean, I do think that there's a public relations battle going on, and the Chinese want to sever Europe from the United States, and that's why it's also countering the American description of the Wuhan virus with claims that the American army somehow bizarrely brought this to China to begin with. So there are attempts, I think, to score propaganda points to sever Europe from the United States, and in turn sever weak European states from the rest of the continent. And to the extent that someone is so weak that that they're prepared to be bribed, I just don't see that as a likely dynamic that would be new as a result of the coronavirus. So if the Brits are going to go in one direction, if the Germans are going to go in one direction, I suspect that's the direction that they're going to travel either way. What's more important is what the big anchor states of Europe do, because that tends to provide cover for others and creates a slipstream behind which smaller states might travel. But no, I don't think so.
And just for you as well, have any European heads of states or foreign ministers publicly criticized China's handling of the virus or the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda campaign?
That's a good
to
question.
Your knowledge.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I may be missing a foreign minister statement from but certainly not like the Chancellor of Germany or say, the Prime Minister of the UK or
I think the
Macron.
Czech Republic has been very critical.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Yeah. Finally, a question to you all, I think. How should the US respond to China's propaganda? You know, how can we meet this charm diplomacy in an effective way? And I'll start with you, Peter.
Well, for one, I think we have to have confidence in our own systems. We have to let our procedures and processes work. I do think that there are challenges that we have that the Chinese don't. I mean, how do open societies in an era of globalization protect themselves from pernicious actors who turn our openness against us? That's a big challenge. And we have challenges like, for example, how to open ourselves and maintain even religious services in a time of pandemic. I mean, some of these challenges authoritarian states don't have. They can just shut things down. I mean, the US was built in part to provide safe haven to those who couldn't practice their faith back home. And now we're canceling Easter. That's a pretty bitter pill, I think, for a lot of us to swallow. But I think we have to be kind of confident in ourselves, true to ourselves, and remember that coherent grand strategy begins building from the inside out, which is to say, you have to develop your own cohesive sense of what you as a country want, and then you bring in allies, and then you bring in more layers of allies, and then before you know it, you have a bloc which can, I think, stand united against the Chinese. Because even if there's some confusion, I still think there's basic clarity that there's a difference between, say, an open democratic system like the United States and a closed one like China. And I believe that in the mid-run, on the real metrics that matter, the US is so much better positioned to respond to something like this. The ingenuity, the creativity that's necessary to defeat a pandemic and to rebuild our economy. The Chinese don't have that. So I think we have to stay confident, work together, and trust in ourselves.
What about South Asia, Parna? How can they respond to Chinese propaganda?
So I think, I mean, the immediate response of actually making it a regional response. I mean, both Pakistan and Sri Lanka were part of the teleconference call. They are contributing. So it's the China versus, let's say, South Asian or China versus India charm offensive. And actually, the faulty test kits, the lack of transparency, which China has demonstrated, as well as the sort of quicker response from the countries of the region, will be a much better way to counter what China is trying to do than anything else. And democracies have problems, but democracies sort of even, I mean, I guess what I would see coming out is that all the countries of the region do need to build their healthcare infrastructure better. Because if we look around the world, it is countries like Singapore and Taiwan and South Korea, which have really good health infrastructure, which have managed to do a much better job. And they're all democracies. So I think democracies which have strong healthcare infrastructure, so the South Asian region needs to focus on human capital. And I hope that's the lesson the countries take.
Great. And last word to Patrick. East Asia, how should they counter China's propaganda?
First of all, we should counter it by continuing to investigate the truth. And that includes, as even David Ignatius in the Washington Post today talked about the origins of the virus. This isn't the most urgent problem, but over time, there ought to be a bipartisan commission, scientific investigation into how this came about and lessons learned for our future. I do agree that in our republic in the United States, from the origins of our country, we have been all about a great bargain. And that bargain has been freedom and union at the same time coexisting in our republic. And that means we're not an authoritarian government that can respond right away with the kind of strictures of the Communist Party of China. We don't want to be that. That's not our aspiration. We're the opposite model of that, in fact. And I think Peter's right. We will be resilient. We will reemerge because we have the best foundations on which to build over the mid to long term, even if in the short term we're found caught short. We really, though, must not disengage. We must continue to engage with our allies and partners and like-minded countries like India, throughout East Asia, throughout Europe, including international organizations. So we have to show an example of leadership and be part of this world.
And with that, I think we will end. Thank you very much to the speakers and to the audience for joining us today. And please do check in at hudson.org to see all our resources on the coronavirus. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.